Hi guys, today I'm going to discuss a topic for NSDA, which is on balance, economic globalization is a threat to the national interest of countries. You should know this topic by now, but just to be safe, we get it out there. I'm going to do this in two parts. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the pro side of the motion, and then in another video, I'll do the op side of the motion, right? So we'll start, you all should know what economic globalization is, but very briefly, it's about the free movement of goods, services, technology, labor, all things around the notion of economy. It's a subset of broader globalization, and broader globalization will include politics, culture, and all of those things. But as you will realize when you do your research and when you do the debating, a lot of these things are intertwined, okay? But keep in mind that that's what the core focus of the debate is. More interesting in terms of a definition for this debate, I think, is national interest and how you define national interest and the types of nations will be something that's going to be important and possibly affect the outcome of the debate. To be organized, what I'm going to do is discuss the context a little bit, and then I'm going to give you three arguments. Now, as usual, none of these arguments are kind of gold certified. You know, they will have holes. I'm not going to go into all of the details of the holes, but these are more directions for you to think about and then for you to expand and research before you actually push them out, okay? And some of these things can be broken down into smaller arguments. But the context. Now, from Gov, I think it's really important to establish national interest and talk about what that national interest means and keep the debate focused on the individual nations, right? I think that's going to be key because if you can show that for any particular nation, it's not going to serve the interests of that nation, then it could potentially be a threat. And it's more difficult for the other side to show that for every nation or most nations in most of their contexts, it's going to work out better, right? In Gov, what you want to do is portray trade as, or the winners and losers as trade, is being defined more by where those countries start and some inherent characteristics of those countries, right? So you're going to say that nations that start ahead, nations that have more natural resources, or nations that are more privileged in one way or another will always have a bigger advantage over other nations, okay? So if you look at focus on specific types of nations or focus on these aspects of nations, it's going to be easier for you to show that the national interests of those nations are not served, okay? So keep that in mind in terms of the context when you talk about national interest and the notion of nations. The second thing to think about in terms of the context is we're going to talk about, and it's natural to assume that this will be a debate about the competition between different nations, right? When you think about free trade agreements, those are between nations. Some nations win, other nations lose, that kind of thing. But in the modern economy, there's the bigger player, or one of the biggest players, are also companies, right? International companies. Giant companies like Facebook, Google, Apple have more wealth than many, many nations. And these companies work in between nations. These companies are in a position to shift the GDP or the tide or the outcome of different nations. If a company decides to pull out of a nation or to go into a nation, that drastically affects the outcome, right? So from Gov, you want to introduce the idea that this is also a debate about multinational organizations. And in an economically globalized, open, free world, where capital can move really quickly, the real winners are these companies, right? Because if you look at, even very established economies like America, they're suffering, but their companies are doing really, really well. And the debates they are having is about how to protect their economy to make sure that those companies come back or the capital stays in those countries, okay? So keep that in mind, and you may want to introduce this in the context early on, and think about this when you're framing your arguments, that it's not just a debate about countries, but also about companies and how those companies are moving wealth and capital and services and talent between the different countries. Last thing to think about when you're in Gov is what your alternative is, or whether you need to provide an alternative, right? You're going to sound very protectionist from Gov. And it's difficult for a fully protectionist economy to succeed, or to find examples of where those economies have succeeded, right? Trump is now going on a protectionist tilt. With the rise of nationalism in Europe, many of those parties are proposing more inward-looking policies, including protectionist economic policies. But in the long arc of history, those things have always failed, right? Largely have failed. Now, so you have to be pretty balanced. You're not arguing a kind of closed economy. It's difficult to say the Cuban model is going to work and we should shut down. But and in the same time, I don't think you need to provide an alternative to free trade as it is, right? So we are where we are now, and we are going to live in an economically globalized world. But what we need to do is to, one, be aware of the risks. And you are going to argue that there are lots of risks. And when there are lots of risks, countries go in with their eyes open, and they can be more careful, and they can build contingencies and fail-safes. And you can argue for more responsible trade, right? So rather than pushing free trade and economic globalization, we need to do it at a pace in which countries can cope. And we need to build fail-safes, and we need to ensure that people aren't exploited in that trade. Okay, cool. That's the context. Let's go to the arguments. So the first argument that I think you should run, the major one, and you should got a hint of this from my context, is that free trade is unbalanced. Free trade favors those who have the biggest advantage to move up really quickly, right? The nature of a fully open market is that it allows people to exploit advantages, right? So the company that is biggest, the country that has most capital, most resources, can move in, turn an economy around, and then exploit it and make profit. Okay, so you argue this as an inherent weakness of the system, and then you establish that the world is not flat, right? Economically, the world is already incredibly unbalanced. Some of those imbalances were inherent because of what countries chose to prioritize in terms of development. Other of those imbalances were inherited because we live in a post-colonial world, the entire world, right? During the period of colonization, some countries drastically exploited, hugely exploited other countries. And those other countries, that's a little loud. I'm gonna wait for that to pass. Don't worry, I'm okay. At least I think I'm okay. So the fact is, we live in a post-colonial world. Like, the entire world is shaped by the history of colonization. Some countries exploited the position they were in point in history and grew rapidly and colonized other countries. Or even if they didn't fully colonize, they exploited those resources and used them to develop and get huge advantages. And these other countries that were colonized for sometimes tens, for more often hundreds of years, are at a systemic disadvantage. And that disadvantage isn't easily righted, right? They enter everything now from that disadvantage, right? All the giant palaces in Europe and the huge universities in America, and all of those things were built upon the riches exploited from colonization and from exploiting other countries. Okay, so the global economic system is at this huge advantage, and having a freer system only accentuates and grows this advantage. Where you have exceptions, and they may be few, like in case of China or South Korea, countries that in the recent years have managed to develop really quickly, those are exceptions. And those exceptions are reliant on that economy maybe being suppressed before, like in the case of South Korea, also in China, and then suddenly growing very quickly, or having some inherent advantages. Like in the case of China, its huge size, right? Which helps them grow. And these things may not be available to other countries, okay? So that's the first thing that you have to run with, that in a global open system, people who are ahead are going to only get further ahead, and the evidence backs this. In the early years of growth, you saw poverty as a whole rising quite quickly, right? In the 60 years or so since we've really embraced free trade. But then very quickly we saw the haves and have-nots and the gaps and inequality really rising, right? So within countries, you see a much larger gap between the rich and poor today than you would 10, 20 or 30 years ago. And between countries, you see a much larger gap between the rich and poor today than you do 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? And more trade is only going to make that worse, okay? So that's the first argument. The second argument is about a loss of control, right? So now this argument is about in principle. So regardless, in the first argument, you're saying nations, every nation except the first few are going to really struggle to take advantage, and the ranking is never going to change, or very unlikely to change. So it's for the majority of nations underneath, they're going to suffer, and it'll be a threat to their national interests. In the second argument, or the second argument I'm saying, which is about the loss of control, every country, regardless of where they sit on the balance, has less control over their economy. Less control over who can enter their economy and sell them things, less control over whether money can move out of their country to another country, less control over whether other companies can buy their companies, right? Because in a global economy, companies and countries need to have the freedom to do those things. This loss of control means it's really difficult for countries to protect their people, to react to things, to make long-term plans, right? So even big countries, established economies now, like the US, are seeing a huge loss in income and people struggling in the middle class or in the lower classes and thinking about ways to protect their economy, right? So they're like the whole steel tariff that Trump announced is about stopping jobs from moving overseas. And this isn't just a notion of outsourcing. In a globalized economy, it's much easier for a company to enter a market, right? So say a supermarket or a bank or anything, do really well there and outcompete with the local companies, and then those local banks, local supermarkets, or local manufacturers will close down. And now most of the money made will be made by the owners, and those owners are based overseas, right? And those owners may not be paying tax in the local country. They may be paying tax overseas or nowhere. They may be paying tax in a tax haven, or they move their money somewhere else. And that's the issue with giant companies like Facebook or Apple that sell a lot of their products overseas, but don't pay tax in the countries in which they sell, but neither do they pay tax in the countries which they are from, right? They don't really pay tax anywhere, okay? So this argument is because the economy is so open and so flexible, it's really difficult to control how trade happens. It's really difficult to do things that protect the people involved in trade. And it's really difficult to reap the benefits that are attached to that trade, right? Because taxes may flow outside the country or they may flow elsewhere, okay? People may argue that the trade-off is good because you get more diverse and you get cheaper products, but in the long run, the markets will suffer. People will lose their jobs or have low-paying jobs and can't buy those products. And then, they struggle to sustain the market, and then that company is going to leave and go somewhere else, right? Which is what you see happening in large economies like the US, okay? The last argument I'm going to make here, which I think you can run, is going to be slightly different. The first two, and I think the broad focus of this debate is about the economy and the national economic interest. But I think there is space in this debate to run an argument around culture or national values or identity, and say the global economy or economic globalization is shifting those things, right? It's changing what it means to be a member of a specific nation or a member of a specific community. It is diluting culture and language and tradition, and those things, and the dilution of those things mean that people feel more threatened, people feel less sense of belonging and a motivation to want to do better for that country, right? So either people move or people become more close-minded and people become more xenophobic or start to attack foreigners and stuff a little bit more because they feel that that sense of belonging to that nation is lost. Now, you're saying, but hey, Logan, this is not a debate about culture, this is a debate about the economy. True, but products and economic products shape culture and shape values, right? The economy is weighted. The products that you buy come with a specific cultural attachment around those things. right? The language of media shapes or has an impact on your local languages. Sport, the international sport shapes your values. The international media shapes your values, right? Global products enter and shape the value of a certain nation. So products, you can argue, also have cultural values, and those cultural values are shifted when the product shifts, okay, or enters a market or economy, right? So that argument may seem a little bit loose for you, and it's purposefully shaped that way, right? I don't think this will be a core argument, but I think it's valuable to think about the larger, broader political, cultural meanings of economy, and think about how that has an impact on the nation and how that has an impact on national interest, okay? This is not to shift away the economic aspect of the debate, but this is to say that the economy is more than about jobs and more than about whether people can afford to put food on the table, and that's really valuable. But the sense of identity and language and belonging and culture are also incredibly valuable, and to some extent, that's what defines a nation as distinct from another nation, right? The notion that people within that nation share something special that is different from people from another nation share. And not that it's so special that no one else can be part of that, but it has to feel a little unique, okay? If you want to support this idea of a nation being distinct, right? So that is my view of this debate. In summary, the context is going to be important, painting the context of national self-interest and what is threat, looking at the idea of trade being kind of inherently, imbalanced, and then being very careful about what you defend in terms of trade, and not having to defend protectionism, but defending defending responsible trade, Freudian slip. And the three arguments about trade being inherently, or free trade always preferencing those who have the most, talking about loss of control and why that affects everybody, and finally this idea of culture. Okay, so the con side will come in the next video, but for now I hope this was helpful. Good luck and happy researching.